Hi, John Herman here. Missed you last week. Today, I'd like to conclude our study of the Sermon on the Mount by focusing on some of the highlights of its remaining section. In Matthew's book, the whole sermon is covered in chapters 5 through 7. Today, we're going to cover verses 6:1 through 7:12. I strongly urge you to read the passages as we study them so it makes more sense to you, since I will not be reading them in their entirety. So let's begin with chapter 6, verses 1 through 4. Jesus talks about giving to the needy. Jesus' message here is not so much that we ought to give to the needy, but how to do it. He tells us not to tell others of our giving habits so that we might gain prestige. When we do that, we might receive honor in this life, but it will be our only reward, as opposed to a heavenly one. In verse 3, Jesus talks about the right hand not knowing what the left one is doing. What do you think he means by that? I think he might be talking about our personal pride and about being impressed by our own generosity. I think the whole lesson here is about pride. All right. In verses 5 through 15, Jesus talks about prayer. In Jesus' day, many of the Jews had assigned certain times of the day for prayer. If they happened to be in a public place, they would stop what they were doing and recite the prayer. Of course, bystanders would notice how religious they were. Over time, they would just so happen to be in a public place at prayer time. Again, it's a pride thing, which is what Jesus is condemning. In verse 7, Jesus points out that the effectiveness of prayer is not related to its length. He says, "Don't keep babbling like the pagans, for they think they will be heard because of their many words." In verse 8, Jesus said that God knows our needs before we ask. So the question then becomes, why should we bother praying at all? Well, for one, we are commanded to. Number 2, a living relationship requires interaction, a flow of words. Our relationship with God is greatly strengthened when we converse with Him. Now finally, in verses 9 through 15, Jesus gives us an example of how we should pray by way of the Lord's Prayer. Notice that the prayer is short and also that it is comprehensive. It deals with God's program and man's needs. Notice also the priority. God's program comes first, then our needs. Do you think that constantly repeating the same prayer to God is a problem? Does it lose its meaning and effectiveness? I think that it is displeasing to God only if parroted in a mindless fashion without actually thinking about what we are saying. All right, let's move on to verses 16 through 18. Jesus talks about fasting. In Jesus' day, fasting was done on Monday and Thursday. It's probably no coincidence that these were the market days when people would gather to buy and sell. What a great opportunity to show others how pious you were. The Jews knew how to wring every drop of self-gratification out of this practice. They left their hair unkempt, their faces dirty, and they wore a gaunt look on their faces that worked upon the sympathy and admiration of the less committed. This outward ostentation is what Jesus is condemning. Again, it's about pride. C.S. Lewis was right in calling pride the great sin. So let me ask you this. Do you think Christians should fast even today? Jesus did, but the disciples didn't. The New Testament church did, as did Paul. However, it is not required. So what are some reasons that we might consider fasting? 1, it's likely to be beneficial to our health. 2, it develops practices of self-discipline. Paul said that a person should learn to rule over his body. 3, it teaches us to do without things that are not essential. And 4, it intensifies our pleasure and satisfaction of the good things in life. It reminds me of the saying, absence makes the heart grow fonder. All right, verses 19 through 24. Jesus talks about treasures in heaven. These are the verses that address the issue of money and wealth. For example, verse 19 starts out, do not store up for yourselves treasures on earth, where moth and rust destroy, and where thieves break in and steal. But store up for yourselves treasures in heaven. Jesus tells us not to store up treasures on earth. When we do this, we tend to set our hearts on earthly things and pleasures. It's important to realize that they are temporary, and we should really be focusing on things that will bring us eternal happiness. So exactly how do we store up treasures in heaven? Among other ways, it might include supporting the proclamation of the gospel, supporting the works of the church, and caring for the needs of those less fortunate than we. It has been said that life's passing pleasures are like an amusement park ride. The price is high and the ride is short. I think the crux of Jesus' point is stated in verse 21. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. I think Jesus is highlighting a temptation that Satan has devised in order to prevent us from having a close relationship with God. That's his goal. Satan wants to convince us that by obtaining wealth and pleasure, we will be totally happy. So, how do we tell if wealth and material possessions are the most important things in our lives? Well, let me ask you this. What do you spend the most time thinking about? There is your answer. Do you think that Jesus is saying that we should not save for future needs? No. Think about Joseph, who stored grain for future needs. Or in Proverbs, where we are instructed to study the ant, which prepares for the future. Or in Corinthians, where Christians are instructed to set money aside to provide for the needs of others. Saving itself is not condemned, only the materialistic motive. Well, one more question. Do you think it's wrong to be wealthy? The problem is this. With wealth comes responsibility. Jesus says, to whom much is given, much is required. Remember, though, that when you hear that statement, the much does not only refer to money, but also to talents, knowledge, time, and so forth. I came across a story told by Pastor Bob Deffenbaugh that kind of caught my eye, and I think you'll see why. Here's the story. A farmer one day reported to his wife with great joy that his best cow had given birth to twin calves, one red and one white. He said, "You know, I have been led of the Lord to dedicate one of the calves to him. We will raise them together. Then when the time comes to sell them, we will keep the proceeds that come from one calf, and we will give the proceeds that come from the other to the Lord's work." His wife asked which calf he was going to dedicate to the Lord, but he answered that there was no need to decide just then. "We'll treat them both in the same way," he said, "and when that time comes, we'll sell them as I have said." Now, several months later, the man entered the kitchen looking very sad and miserable. When his wife asked him what was troubling him, he said, "I have some bad news for you. The Lord's calf is dead." But his wife reminded him, "You had not decided which was to be the Lord's calf." "Oh, yes," he said, "I had always determined that it was to be the white one, and it is the white calf that has died. The storyteller's comment was that it is always the Lord's calf that dies, unless we are absolutely clear about our service to Him and about the true nature of our possessions. Enough said. All right, verses 25 through 34. Jesus talks about worry. In these verses, Jesus reminds us about the futility of worrying. What does he mean by worrying? To worry is to be preoccupied with things that are future, hypothetical, and beyond our control. Worry is both illogical and unprofitable. It only sees obstacles, either actual or imaginary, and concerns itself with all the possible disastrous results. It's the antithesis of faith. It totally ignores the belief that God truly loves us and that all things that happen to us are for our ultimate good and benefit. We could go one step further and say that to doubt God's goodness is in effect calling Him a liar. Worrying is a serious sin. Jesus asks, who of you by worrying can add a single hour to his life? When you think about that statement, the exact opposite is actually true. Worrying undermines our health and actually shortens our lifespan. Now, there's a difference between being worried and being concerned. Certainly, we should be concerned about certain things. It helps us to be diligent and prudent. In 2 Corinthians, Paul said, apart from other things, there is the daily pressure on me of my anxious concern for all the churches. He had a concern for the churches, but not a worry. The biggest difference in the two terms is that with worried, you shut God out of the loop and expect that the only solution depends on you. However, if you introduce God between you and your problem, you now have concern. The problem is not hopeless because God is your hope. That's the reason Paul had concern, not worry, over the churches. He prayed to God over his concerns and had faith that God would prevail. In verse 33, Jesus said, but first seek the kingdom and the righteousness, and all these things will be given to you as well. Here, the things Jesus was talking about refers to his previous example of worrying about food and clothing. But of course, it carries over to everything we worry about. Our spiritual life must come first, and secondly, our material well-being. Once our priorities are in order, we will not be so concerned with material things. Remember, by not worrying, we are not guaranteed a life free from trouble. However, by including God in the equation, we have someone who we can depend upon to give us the strength to persevere. All right, now we're moving on to chapter 7, verses 1 through 6. Jesus talks about judging others. The two parts we tend to remember in these verses are that 1, we will be judged as we judge others, and 2, about removing the plank from our eyes before we remove the speck from our brothers. Do you think it's appropriate to judge others? According to Pastor Chip Bell, there are two types of judgment: condemning judgment and discerning judgment. He gives an example. When a new pastor or staff member comes to our church, there are two kind of responses. Some will look to discover what's wrong with the new person. Others will look to discover how God has gifted them and what that person can contribute to the body of the church. Does that sound familiar? You can always find something wrong with anything, any program, any person, any plan, whether church-related or not. Pastor Bell asks, Are you the one that always tends to search for what's wrong with it? He then says, if you are, then stop it. Stop judging. However, there are those who can discern potential pitfalls in a plan or even a person. They judge in a non-judgmental way because they do it to make the situation better. They do not seek personal attention for their views, but only for the greater good. In these verses, Jesus is speaking to the likes of the Pharisees. He's talking to people who like to put others down while elevating themselves. In their smugness, the Pharisees judged the masses based on the beliefs that only they had kept all of the neat collection of laws that, if followed, would guarantee righteousness. Jesus, of course, could see that there was only an external righteousness. Pride rears its head once again. Now, in the last verse in this series, verse 6, it doesn't seem to belong with either this portion or the next. It made no sense to me when I first read it. This is the verse in which Jesus tells the disciples and us not to give to dogs what is sacred or to throw pearls to pigs. I did some digging, and the explanation that makes the most sense to me comes from a man named John Quinn. Most other explanations, though, were in the same ballpark. The idea here is that the disciples, or we, should not persist in offering what is sacred or of value, in other words, the gospel, to those, meaning the dogs, who have no appreciation for it. The argument is that our gift will not only become contaminated and despised, but our efforts could also be rebuffed and perhaps even openly attacked. Our evangelic energies are represented by God's pearls. We must show discernment as to how we use that energy. We should pray that we know when to hold them and know when to fold them. All right, verses 7 through 11. Ask, seek, and knock. Jesus said, ask and it will be given to you. Seek and you will find. Knock and the door will be opened to you. This is how Jesus starts out the section. I'm guessing an hour-long sermon could and has been preached on these words. But to boil it down, I think Jesus is talking about the need for constant and persistent prayer. Just because we may not receive the answer or result we want or expect is no reason to quit praying. God knows best, and we should pray for faith and wisdom to understand that. You know, we may be unknowingly be praying for something that God knows is not in our best interest. All right, verse 12 deals with the golden rule. Again, this verse does not seem to fit in the context of the surrounding verses. But looking further, the idea of doing unto others is found in Old Testament commands. It's found in Hinduism, Buddhism, Confucianism, and in various forms of Greek and Roman ethical teachings. However, the interesting detail is that this is the only place it appears in a positive form. What I mean by that is the negative form says, don't do unto others what you don't want them to do unto you. The point is that it's not as hard to refrain from doing harm to others as it is to do something good for them. Well, now I think I'll end here. There are 3 more subsections that conclude the sermon, but I don't want to wear out my welcome. If you're interested in reading them, they are found in verses 13 through 27. I invite you to be your own teacher and investigate for yourselves the message Jesus is presenting. It's a good homework assignment. Jesus' sermon has an incredible amount of material to digest. I pray that you will ponder its meaning and apply it to your lives. I have personally heard it all before, but hearing it again is like a shot of adrenaline to me. I don't know about you, but a friendly reminder is always welcome. especially as my aging brain seems to be shriveling. Peace be with you.